Okay, Jillian, this one is just for you. So this is really the first time that I've done this. Just so you know, Brett, I assume you're going to be listening to this too, so you can kind of help explain. Jillian, right now, this is my normal voice. This is the way I always talk. This is who you know. What you're about to hear is what Brett and I call our representative, someone that you just kind of send in there. This is like, it's like work you, basically. It's not actually what happens, but your friends will know it differently. So here we go. What we're going to start with today, this is the American Revolution. Now, this is between the time periods of 1776 to 1780. Based on timing, I might have an opportunity to get as far as I would like. I have a feeling, though, I'm only going to get to the beginnings of the war itself. So to begin the American Revolution, first off, the American colonies were just simply one small piece of the great British Empire. There was an old saying that said the sun never sets on the British Empire because at one point they controlled at least a piece of every continent in the world. At their peak, roughly about 1/4 of the world was under British control. They are going to have holdings all over the world, and we were just one small piece of that particular empire. Now, the Brits were different colonizers than other Europeans. The way that the Brits would colonize is they saw their colonies as more as business, as investments. They weren't there to plunder as some of their previous counterparts were. The Spanish were very good at plundering, even the Portuguese, just exploiting natural resources, exploiting the people that were there. The Brits saw this more as a long-term investment. In doing so, they gave the American colonies a great deal of autonomy, a great deal of freedom. They allowed them to basically just form their own governments because the British central government was all the way across the Atlantic. And in the best of conditions, getting across the Atlantic in the 1700s would take approximately 8 weeks if you were lucky in the best of conditions. Along that way, probably about somewhere between about 1/4 to 1/8 of the people on the ship would die from some horrible diseases or by accidents. It's a very difficult time period, and in what will eventually be the United States, there's an enormous amount of freedom and opportunity and economic prosperity that didn't exist really anywhere else in the world. In fact, if you could pick, being in the American colonies in the mid to late 1700s was probably the safest place on earth to be. But as the founders are going to explain, it's that safety that's going to be one of the reasons that gave them an opportunity to read through some of the thinkers at the time saying that they wanted to question the British monarchy, and not just the British monarchy all over the world. The British monarchy had total control over these colonists. Now, of course, there are plenty of arguments that say that, yes, Parliament is actually the one who is pulling the strings, who has the power, and there's plenty of cases to be made for that. But in actuality, it still is the king who is the ultimate power of the British Empire. He is the sole executor of the entire empire, and the American colonists consider themselves very loyal British citizens. In fact, for years and years before this, they, in fact, saw the king as their own personal protector. He had promised to bring British power across the Atlantic if needs be. In fact, the king does it on several occasions. Most of the American colonists saw themselves as loyal British citizens, even when King George III takes the throne in 1760. Now, King George III had come from a long line of British monarchs who had basically been told ever since that they were children that one day you will be the head of the single biggest empire that the world has ever seen. It dwarfed every other empire that the world had known. They were a major seafaring empire that, as I said previously, had dominated every part of the globe. What will be the United States is just one small piece of that empire. But when King George III comes to power, he sees the Americans as more of a thorn in his side before his father previous to him. In fact, King George III, when he comes to power, he starts to treat these American colonists as more British citizens and start to slowly chip away at their autonomy. And one of the big moments of this is when King George III demands that there be taxes placed upon the American citizens to pay for the French and Indian War. Now, long story short, the French and Indian War is fought before this time. It's going to be when the French make incursions into what will be the United States from Canada. There is a decently bloody war that takes place between the American colonists and their French enemy and their Indian allies. where the British Empire did in fact show up to protect the American colonies. They sent the British Navy, the finest navy in the world. They'd sent British regulars. It was a war in the Western Hemisphere where the British king did support the American colonists. And when King George III comes to power, he says it's only fair for the American colonists to pay for this protection. Now, yes, again, Parliament did in fact approve of these taxes, where we get that saying that I'm sure that everyone learned in the United States history: no taxation without representation. These taxes were placed upon the American colonists even when they didn't have representation in Parliament. They had no say over these taxes, and they start to begin to think that perhaps this king, perhaps this Parliament, is no longer protecting them. Perhaps they're in fact oppressing them. Now, this again comes back to some of an English philosopher by the name of John Locke, who is going to make a lot of enemies within the English court when he starts saying that the idea of the divine right monarch, the king who has ultimate authority and his authority comes from God, is in fact backwards. What kings around Europe even would say is that the people of my nation, of my empire, exist to serve me. What John Locke says is, no, you have it wrong. In fact, you exist to serve us. And this makes him a lot of enemies, again, within the British court. However, he writes down his thoughts, and the American founders are going to read through it. And they start taking his thoughts and even kind of tweaking them to their own ends, and they start saying that there are powers, there are rights that are beyond king and parliament. Things that are given to you as a maxim, that you are given at birth, that is given to you by God, your creator, that you have rights, that you have life, liberty, and what the founder said is the pursuit of happiness. And this existed before king and parliament even became an entity. And they said that you are born with these, and that anyone who deviates from this is in fact in violation of God's rights. And no man and no king and no parliament can take these away from you. When this king starts, in fact, enacting these different these taxes, these American colonists start saying, it's time for us to break away. Now, you have to understand what these men were in for. When they signed the Declaration of Independence, they know for a fact that the British Empire is on the way. In fact, they've already occupied New York by the time the Declaration of Independence was sent. They have the single biggest power in the history of mankind on its way, and they need to act fast. When independence is declared, one of the first things the founders do is they need to figure out how they're going to defend themselves. Now, when all this is taking place, the colonies really do see themselves as basically 13 independent states. There's not necessarily a great deal of unity. In fact, even declaring independence took really an amazing sales pitch from many of these founding fathers that it took to even bring the southern colonies into this idea. The southern colonies really were overwhelmingly loyalist. They didn't want anything to do with revolution. In order to be certain that those southern colonies would come on board, they knew they had to have a southerner as the commander. It was the New England colonies that were stirring up trouble for the Brits. It was the New England colonies that were, in fact, tarring and feathering tax collectors. It was the New England colonies who were subject to the Boston Massacre. It was the New England colonies that are going to bring about the Boston Tea Party. The Southern colonies had nothing to do with this. This wasn't, in fact, their war the way that many of them felt. In order to bring them along, we know we have to have a Southern commander, and the choice was actually fairly easy. George Washington is going to be named the head of the Continental Army. Now, George Washington had several advantages that made him an easy choice for this. One, he was in the British Army. He was a non-commissioned officer in the British Army. He'd fought for the British Army for years and years. But he had retired in years since, and ever since then, he had been really living on his plantation. He was hoping to really retire, but when his new nation called upon him, he steps up. Now, there's some other things about Washington. One, he's simply just charismatic, for one. He was a born leader, and he was a born commander. He was also just a big, imposing figure. He was probably about 6'2", when the average height of an American, who were some of the healthiest and biggest people in the world at that point, was probably about 5'9". So in any room, he dominated. He took it over. He was well known, and in fact, he was a great athlete. Everyone knew him to be this charismatic, well-carried gentleman of the southern colonies, and in fact, a military genius. Now, his genius is going to have to be proven over and over again because his army is at best a bunch of ragtags, a bunch of untrained militia. Now, I will say the American frontiersmen were fiercely independent. They had grown up with the idea of that there's no one else to call upon but yourself. If you want to rely on the English Empire to protect you, they have to come across the Atlantic. You need to be very independent. Now, this is going to serve them well, but at the same time, the single biggest fighting force on the planet is on the way. Washington has to figure out how to use these ragtags as best he can. But he's going to have to rely on some very old military tactics in trying to use these bunch of ragtags against the finest army on the earth. When the British army is on the way, we know for a fact we are outmanned, outgunned, and outsupplied. But we do have some advantages going for us. One of the first things is we are playing defense. The defender always has an automatic advantage over offense, as they have to move the defense. Now, there's an old theory that says that if you're going to be on offense, you should have at least a 3-to-1 advantage before engaging an opponent who's prepared and defended. Now, we learn these things from the British military schools. Washington knew this. He grew up with the British military traditions. He's aware of the advantages he has, and he knows for a fact the Brits are going to bring an enormous amount of firepower. They're going to send some of the biggest British warships across the Atlantic in hopes of intimidating the American colonists to back down. Now, one of these advantages is they simply have a professional army. They're supplied by tax dollars. They're supplied from all over the world and the British colonies. They are well-trained, well-financed, well-supplied, and they know exactly what they're doing. They also have the biggest navy on Earth. Now, it's well known that the British Navy is by far the best in the world at this time. If you're going to have a seafaring empire, you better have the biggest navy in the world to protect it. Those British ships of the line, the British man-o-wars, are on the way, and in just one of those British battleships, they have more firepower than the entire city of New York. Now, it depends kind of what you look at as far as the invading fleet, but they're going to send about 20 warships into New York Harbor in hopes of intimidating the colonists to back down. The thing is, this is where there's a problem with the British plan. They have overwhelming firepower. Had they used it to its absolute fullest, they would have crushed the colonists. It would have been over in an afternoon. But there's a certain kind of public relations mission that goes with this. If you want to try and simply just decimate the colonists, they could do it. They had the firepower, easily, without a doubt. But the problem they have is these are still British citizens. They don't want to simply annihilate them. They want to defeat them and then, in fact, bring them back to the empire. So they need to divide and conquer. They need to isolate the New England colonies. They need to cut them off. They need to, in fact, subdue the most rebellious colonies, and then the other colonies should fall into line. Now, Jillian, I will leave you with this for right now because I'm about to run out of time. I'm going to send this off to you, but I need you to tell me exactly what you think about this. Good, bad, indifferent, things to change, what you liked, what you didn't. And if you really want to, I'll continue the story. But I'll send this off to you. Let me know what you think. Okay? Thanks.